It's a big deal. It should be treated like a big deal, but it's getting like no attention. So let's talk about it. Germany has arrested 2 suspected Russian spies over a bombing plot. Now, before I get into, everything else, I want to talk about the legitimacy of the claim, because the source for this is, of course, the German government who was doing the investigation. But to be blunt with you guys, I'm more likely to believe this not only because of previous reports we're going to get into in the future, but also because one of the suspects in question also fought for the Russians in the Donbass between 2014 and 2016. So fought for them in 2 years with the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine that was under wraps, but not really under wraps, that they denied, but were also kind of doing it openly, as many OPSEC reports were able to show. Now, this is not the first attempt at industrial sabotage or undermining of Ukrainian support, which was going to be the target of these attacks, was going to be to try to undercut support for Ukraine by bombing different important locations, whether it be a U.S. military base, which was considered, or German industry, which was also considered. Could you imagine the Russians just planting bombs in an American military base, the bases that are training the Abrams crews so they know how to pilot the Abrams? They just plant bombs in there, blow it up, and end up killing American soldiers, maybe by accident. Because again, these are not like the most top level spies. These are people they're trying to recruit in order to do their spying for them, in large part as foreigners, in order to do their sabotage for them. Another example would be earlier in the war, the Russians were caught trying to hire, and this is so fucked up. This actually gets under my skin a little bit. They were trying to hire refugees to take a bomb and plant it in the Polish railway system to blow it up, so that the railway system would be so destroyed and damaged, it would be unable to transport goods, especially goods, to Ukraine, since Poland is the main way how support to Ukraine gets to Ukraine. And since Russia cannot directly strike NATO without, possibly triggering Article 5, unless they wanted to probe it and pretend it was an accident, something like that, their idea was to try to give a bomb to a refugee and tell them to blow it up for money. So taking advantage of refugees who are unbelievably in a horrible position, with them fleeing the war, poor, trying to bribe them into blowing up a railway, knowing for sure that they would get caught. Not only would they get caught, but then they would face serious legal repercussions as a refugee. So they would be a refugee and they'd be a criminal. Not a good time. So this isn't the first time that this has been, and even if we wanted to go closer to industrial sabotage, we can actually go back to like 2014, when there were explosions that happened at Czech ammunition facilities back in 2014, when the war with Ukraine was first going on, and this facility was providing munitions to the Ukrainians. So this is not something that's 100% new, but they are getting more bold, and it's a lot easier to connect them to it, since we're finding out like this was 100% like a Russian operation from the Germans. Let's read a little bit into the article. Bavarian police have arrested and accused 2 men of being Russian secret agents planning to bomb industrial and military sites in Germany to disrupt the delivery of aid to Ukraine. The 2 German-Russian nationals were detained in raids on Wednesday morning by the way, can I just throw out there that bombings that kill people can still be considered like an attack on the country, just like the apartment bombings could be considered casus belli to try to attack another country, or like that's what the Russians use to try to justify their invasion and then occupation of Chechnya. And so if they ended up bombing a U.S. military base and killing some personnel, and if you bomb a munitions factory, I do want to throw out there that a munitions factory is pretty explosive, so there'd be a chance that you would just set up the whole thing ablaze and then you kill a bunch of people. So this is something that carries real risk to not only, of course, the supply lines, German sovereignty, but also human life. The 2 German-Russian nationals were detained in raids on Wednesday morning by police special forces in the town of Bayreuth in southeast Germany, according to a federal prosecutor's office. Dieter 39, and Alexander, 37, had been in communication with Russia's military intelligence agency to plan acts of sabotage on German soil. The Russian spy agency has been accused by Western governments of an attempted assassination in 2018 of Sergei Skripal. They actually did carry out a successful assassination of a former Chechen soldier, and I believe it was in a Berlin park. They just went up, bam, 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 killed them. And ever since, the Russians have been trying to get that assassin back. There was actually rumors that Putin was going to trade Alexei Navalny for the guy who assassinated that Chechen national. The Russian spy agency has been accused of Western governments of attempted assassinations in 2018 of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, and other murders across Europe in recent years, including a fatal
Tier 4 subscription.
Hey,
Unstealthy sub.
Thank you for the unstealthy sub. But it was still stealthier than the Russian intelligence agencies, including a 2019 fatal attack in Berlin. Russia has stepped up its undercover activities in Europe in recent months, but the possible use of agents to carry out violent attacks in the EU is a sign of the Kremlin's growing boldness and risk appetite, according to European security officials. The arrested suspects are alleged to have scouted targets that include a U.S. military base, again, which would have U.S. soldiers, putting U.S. personnel at risk, and the Ukrainian soldiers being trained there at risk. Industrial and transport facilities had also been identified for potential attacks by them. Photographs, videos, and maps, so I think pretty good evidence that they were trying to scout it out, had been made of the sites that might be suitable targets. Our security authorities have prevented possible explosive attacks that were intended to target and undermine our military assistance to Ukraine. It is a particularly serious case of alleged spy activity for Putin's criminal regime, said Germany's Interior Minister Nancy Faeser. We will continue to provide massive support for Ukraine and will not allow ourselves to be intimidated, she added, adding that police were now working to identify the wider network of the two suspects. Dieter had been on the radar of German security authorities for some time. Between 2014 and 2016, he was active in eastern Ukraine as a fighter for the Russian-led separatists in the Donetsk region, according to a German federal prosecutor. Germany has emerged as a leading, let me just read this last one. Germany has emerged as a leading target for Russian clandestine operations in Europe. Berlin is the country's largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine, and under its current government has upended a decades-long policy of engagement with Russia following the Kremlin's brutal full-scale invasion of its neighbor. Russian intelligence agencies have tried to tap into still widespread German unease about supporting Ukraine and exploit gaps in the country's domestic security, which is still relatively permissive compared with other NATO states owing to its historical concern over government surveillance and policing. Germany's security agencies say they're increasing their counterintelligence efforts. It is barely a month since authorities arrested a senior officer in the defense ministry who they said was passing secret equipment procurement plans to Russia. Now, this is probably the most bold operation that the Russians have attempted to use Russian-German people, the Russian-German community, because there's a quite large Russian community in Germany, and specifically a fighter to try to do a bombing, which, who knows, could it have killed U.S. soldiers? What was the full plan? Could it have killed German workers at a company like Rheinmetall, who was making weapons for Ukraine? This is on top of the attempts to bomb the rail lines in Poland. So bombing attempts in Poland, bombing attempts in Germany, possible bombing attempts back even in 2014 when we talk about the Czech Republic. We're not even talking about the communication lines that were damaged in the Baltic Sea that many people suspect was the Russians as well. People talk about Nord Stream. Nobody talks about those lines that were cut by an anchor being dragged across the water, probably a Chinese ship from the story that I read. Could have been collaboration. Who knows? Point is, though, the Russian, even though we don't know due to the vagueness and purposeful obscurity that the Russians are trying to keep these operations, to keep the public from knowing this, the Russians are attempting to engage in industrial sabotage in Europe. The Russians are attempting to use violence to undermine support for Ukraine. They aren't just using violence, mind you. They are also trying to buy out support. We already know that a ton of Moldovan politicians have been caught with literal bags and bags of cash given to them by Russian agents in order to take pro-Russian policies in Moldova. And there's also been recent reports from the Czech media of German far-right candidates who would have thought the AfD being accused of taking Russian money to spread Russian misinformation. And this is Peter Breiston, who, by the way, claims to be the foreign policy voice of the AfD. which is seeing its popularity rise and is likely to gain more seats in the European Parliament as it rises to about, I think, like 20% in the polls, which doesn't sound like a lot from an American perspective, but trust me, when it comes to a far-right party in Germany, and it comes to, you know, where the other parties are polling right now, that is very sizable as they're trying to normalize their party and try to find some way to get involved in some sort of coalition government to get themselves into power. This is on top of the fact that multiple AfD elected members have traveled to occupied Ukrainian territories, praised the occupation, praised the Donetsk People's Republic, etc., and even did some versions of election monitoring on behalf of the Russians, so helping them engage in their occupation. This is on top of accusations of monetary payments and proof of monetary payments that we've had in Moldova. That's on top of the monetary payments that we know that they were doing, the corruption that they were fostering in Ukraine. So this offensive is multifaceted. It's financial. It's been through misinformation as well. We've talked about before how the Russians have tried to increase racial animus in the United States. They'd organize a Black Lives Matter rally, then they didn't organize a counter protest at that same rally, and then the organizer would never show up because it was the Russians. It was Dmitry Prigozhin's group. Or they would try to do similar things with other issues as well. We've seen the Russians trying to invest heavily into the Texit movement. And it's not hard to spot the Texit bots as they're talking about, oh yes, we love Texas and our warm water port. Come on. The bots aren't even trying, man. They're not even trying. Yes, comrade, we love the Texas Oblast and our warm water port. Yeehaw, yippee-ki-yay, indeed. Come on, it's embarrassing, but it's still not good for our national security. It's still not good for our stability. I don't want other countries going here purposely trying to increase animus in the United States, because for the Russians, best case scenario, we all start shooting each other. We all start saying, screw our neighbor. He disagrees with me on politics. Bam, 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 bam. That's bad. We shouldn't do that. That's terrible. But if you look at more fringe members of the Russian, you know what? I don't want to get too much into the Russian ideological conversation, all their infiltration in the United States. I want to stick to this. This is different, though. This is different than the spreading of misinformation. This is different than the spreading of finances in order to try to buy favoritism. This is a violent approach. This is the attempt of organizing bombings in NATO countries. If there was some successful bombing and they ended up killing like 40 staff, 50 staff at Rheinmetall, I mean, the United States called upon NATO countries in Article 5 after 9/11. Well, there's no way you'd get to the same death toll, even if the bombing of Rheinmetall led to the whole facility blowing up. We're working with explosive munitions, after all. It would not be the same. It would still be an attack on Germany. It'd still be an attack that could kill civilians. Or what if it ended up killing American soldiers? What would our response be? What if the Russians were to just deny all culpability? Would the West be prepared to say, we don't believe you, we're responding in some strong way? When the Russians had their missiles crossing into Polish airspace to do loop-de-loops before going back and hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, the Poles knew about it and they didn't shoot it down. Why didn't they shoot it down? Are they scared of escalation? Was it not enough time because it was only in Polish airspace for 30 seconds? If they don't respond, will the Russians think that they can just do it again and again and then go deeper in the Polish airspace, not only testing to see if they can use Poland's airspace as a tool to attack Ukraine, but possibly see if they can just probe NATO defenses generally? Look at their response times. Look at Poland's response time. And hey, after Ukraine, Poland's right there. This is the type of stuff that has to be taken very, very, very seriously. There is a multifaceted approach to try to undercut support for Ukraine, because they know that if the West was politically determined and they invested into their industry to support Ukraine through the long effort, even if Ukraine doesn't take back every inch of territory, which is going to do, or if they're going to attempt to do, whether we like it or not, even if they can't achieve that, if they were to be in a well-suited negotiating position, well-armed, willing to look at the Russians and say, hey, we can fight this out. You want to walk away from the negotiating table? Fine. Send another 100, 200, 300,000 Russians to their death. See how long this favoritism, the political apathy that you've manufactured in Russia turns into disdain for the regime as more of their young die. Let's see how long we can wait this out. If they have the leverage to keep fighting or the leverage to keep destroying the Russian army or to possibly turn the tide, the Russians would be much more likely to negotiate on Ukraine's terms, on terms that we like. And so if they can undermine that support and make it so Ukraine is isolated, then they can negotiate on Russian terms, or not negotiate at all and just keep going. People talk about the Russians negotiating, when to negotiate. Look, the Russians play with negotiation as a way to delay aid. Maybe they mean it, maybe they don't. It's impossible to tell. But after so many times of saying peace, never mind invade, peace, never mind invade, you certainly can't take them out at their word after 200 rounds of failed negotiation and over 20 failed negotiated ceasefires. It's going to be kind of hard to take them at face value. And so you need to make sure that the support's going in. And so if they can isolate Ukraine, then they can undermine that strategy, take Ukraine on its own, and maybe get away from this disaster of a war with some victory. But I didn't think they would go so far as to consider bombing American bases. I didn't think they'd go that far. But this makes me start conspiratizing. And I hate conspiracies. I hate it. But I start thinking about that fire in Pennsylvania a few days ago at the biggest ammunition manufacturing center in the country. It's in Pennsylvania, producing 155mm shells, the exact shells that Ukraine needs for the howitzer systems we gave them, and a fire broke out there. And of course, they said there was a small fire, they contained it, but because we know that this is happening now, I'm going to be looking at all those instances with suspicion. Because I'm going to be thinking, oh, was this just a small fire? Or was this industrial sabotage? Because we know that the Russians are willing to at least attempt violence in order to undermine support for Ukraine. If that is the case, what would the West's response be? If we found out that the Russians blew up a German manufacturing center, we already know that I think it was one drone manufacturing center in the Baltics caught fire and took a lot of damage, I think a year ago. I remember that coming around. But if we had evidence and we knew it was them, what would the West respond with? What would they do in response? They need to start thinking about that. They need to start crafting options on the table and saying, you know, we'll be flexible. You need to make the Russians uncertain of attempting this stuff. You can try to thwart it, and you need to thwart these types of attacks, but you also need to make the Russians unsure of escalating with us. Not just us being unsure of escalating with them, thinking, yeah, if we blow up and kill American soldiers, that'll probably end badly for us. It's probably not a good idea. Maybe we should stop attempting to make plans around that. Because I don't want American soldiers to get blown up. I don't think most Americans want American soldiers to get blown up. And I will also give a warning, if the Russians blow up and kill American soldiers in Germany, I don't think the reaction of the United States public is going to be, oh, I think it's time to, really sit down with those Russians and talk it out. They're going to be mad. And they're going to ask the president to respond with force to increase deterrence. And you could cause a real security crisis. Whether the Russians are just trying to manage risk, this is not good risk management. If this happens, this could be a real point of escalation. And the Russians need to know that. They cannot be just doing bombings in Germany. This is crazy. But if you go on CNN, if you go on MSNBC, you go on NBC News, where's the story? Where is it? I saw it at DW, and it's in the Financial Times. Feel like this should be getting a little bit more attention, especially since after this aid package passes, we're going to be providing the lion's share of military aid to Ukraine. Not necessarily aid, period. The Europeans are taking care of the financial stuff. Our financial aid is a loan. It's not even an aid anymore. This is something we need to think about on American soil. And so I'm ringing the alarm bell now to keep your eye out, man. The post-Cold War era is, I think, over. And this is just one sign of it.